And now turning to our topic tonight, this excellent new book, The Crown and the Capitalists, by Ajahn Wasana Wongsurawat. We had hoped to have the book here tonight. Unfortunately, it is coming down from Chiang Mai Silkworm Books, and the truck could not arrive in time. So we are able to offer the discount that was going to be extended to all of you tonight. If you wanted to buy the book, there is a list at the reception. The retail price is 750 baht. You can buy it for 700 baht. Pay tonight and leave your email address or phone number. And the book will be here on Friday, a week ahead of its release in bookstores and with the discount. So if you would like it, unfortunately we can't send it, but it will be here on Friday for you to pick up. We can keep it as long as you want. So do keep that in mind if you want a copy. And I think after you hear Ajahn talk, you probably will want a copy. So I won't waste much more time. You can read about her background. I'd just like to say that I think Dr. Wasana is one of the most versatile and interesting academics I've come across here in nearly a decade living here in Thailand. She's with the Department of History, right? But she crops up on all kinds of panels ranging from security, regional security to history, anthropology, all kinds of things. In fact, Wasana can address almost every aspect of Thailand's history, and particularly its ethnic makeup and the role of the ethnic Chinese. So I will leave it to her to talk about the book, and there will be plenty of opportunity for questions afterwards. So, Wasana, over to you. Thank you.
Yes. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for having me here. This is very exciting for me. I mean, people are like, I've met some familiar faces, and people say, well, you have been here in such and such occasion. So I think I've been at the FCCT a couple times before, but it was not for my book, right? It was for Chris Baker's book on Ayutthaya and Pimprapai Pisarabut and Jeffrey Sung's book on the history of the Thai Chinese. So I kind of feel like, wow, this is my event, right? So thank you so much. It is such an honor to be here this evening. And I must say this book has been 10 years in the making. So the fact that we have to wait until next week that it's in the bookstore, or some of you would get it tonight, I mean, at a discount price, and then get the book on Friday, is... We can probably wait a couple of days more, right? I've waited 10 years already, so yeah. So just before we started, I had a few talks, some discussion and a couple of wines with Gwen. And the question came up, how much are you going to discuss the present? Like things that happened 2-3 years ago. Is this all going to be the 19th century? At which point we should encourage everyone to get more drinks and fall asleep. And I assured her that at the very end of the book, I end at the post-Cold War period. So I do come up to the 21st century. But in a way, I think even the 19th century stuff, right? Very interestingly, this country is a country that tries to use history to justify a lot of what it does, right? I find it most mind-boggling when the Prime Minister comes and says the younger generation are not patriotic because they don't know history. And I'm like, I teach history. History does not make you patriotic. What kind of history are you talking about? But you hear that again and again and again and again, right? Like, you need to learn history so you would be patriotic. You need to learn history so you would love your country. You need to learn history so you would support the dictator and all that, right? So, and I'm always confused by that. But that just goes to show, right, that the narrative of history is still being used, or people try to use it to justify what they're doing. And I think in that sense, a lot of the things that are in this book and a lot of things that I would talk about today will be about this, about history and about a lot of the subjects that have been used as the foundation of Thai nationalist narrative, right, up to this day. So I think even though I will be talking back to the 19th century all the way up to the 21st century, even the things from the late 19th century, early 20th century would be things that that concern the present as well. Okay. So how do I do this? No, that is not how I do it. Ah, yes. No. I don't know how to use the PowerPoint. Yes. Now I know how to use the PowerPoint. Thank you. Okay. So I was very excited, so I have some grammatical errors here. So there's one country in the whole of Asia that the ruling elite of the 19th century remains the ruling elite in the 21st century. It's very interesting. You try to search, in my mind, right? In the whole of Asia, right? Which other country is the ruling elite of the 19th century still the ruling elite of the 21st century? Okay, they're not the same people, but they descend from the same people. There's the same group, there's the same partnership, they're the same network that are at the very top of the political pyramid. I cannot think of another country in Asia. And of course, the first hand that goes up would say, what about Japan? Japan very obviously is not the same, right? After the Second World War, with Article 9 of the Constitution, Japan could not have a standing military, lost the right to declare war, and the emperor, most importantly, no longer had the political power that was bestowed to him in the pre-war period, right? So in that sense, this makes Siam or Thailand very unique. I would say from the 19th century at least, right? I'm a modern historian, so I don't go much beyond the 19th century. So from the 19th century up to the 21st century, with the exception of just a bit over a decade between 1932 and the end of the Second World War. So with the exception of that short period of time, from the 19th century to the 21st century is the same group of political elite up there, right? I cannot think of another country in Asia that has that situation. Why? Mostly because most of Asia was colonized, right? And once you get rid of the colonizers in the after the Second World War, then you have a new group of rulers, right? And even the countries that was not colonized, I mentioned Japan, for example, or China. China has changed from the 19th century to the 21st century. It was the Qing dynasty, it was the Republic of China, it's now the People's Republic of China. So you don't have this situation. So why is this the case? And how did the elite in Siam or in Thailand manage to stay there for such a long time, for such an extended period of time? I would give out a few hints of what we'll be talking about today. First of all is the situation with the colonial period in Thailand is different from the rest of Asia. I'm not saying, and this has to do with the foundation part, the history that has been used as a foundation of Thai nationalism since forever, right? We get pounded into our heads from kindergarten that like Thailand was never colonized, Thailand was never colonized, Thailand was never colonized, right? So this actually has a lot to do with the relationship of the ruling class and the colonizers, the ruling class and the colonial power, right? Some kind of a connection and the way in which they dealt with external powers that allowed them to be dominant in the scene since the 19th century up to the 21st century. And of course, the name of the book, right? The Crown and the Capitalists, the Ethnic Chinese, and the Founding of the Thai Nation, right? So another suggestion that I might propose is that there is this alliance made between the Crown. The Crown is shorthand for what I call, if I would define it, when I say the Crown, I mean right-wing conservative royalist political groups, which before 1932 would be the royal government, right, of the absolute monarchs, and then after the Second World War would be would include the alliance between the monarchy and the military and right-wing political groups, such as the Democrat Party, if I might say. And the capitalists here, I mean the ethnic Chinese entrepreneurs. So capitalist class of the ethnic Chinese. I'm not trying to say that all the Chinese are in alliance with the Crown, but the richest ones were in alliance with the Crown. And this would include the ethnic Chinese entrepreneurs who enjoyed extraterritorial rights in the period before 1938, when extraterritorial rights were completely abolished from the system. So I'm suggesting that this alliance between the Crown and the capitalists allowed for the ruling elite, because you have the political elite and the economic elite having this alliance together, and that allowed them to stay on top from the 19th century to the 21st century. Now, another thing that has been asked, and I think is an important issue, is that am I going to say anything that would get me jailed? The FCCT is well known for having people come to talk here and then getting lawsuits. I would like to say that my book, if you buy my book, I try to be it's not boring at all, it's very exciting, intriguing and all that, but what I'm trying to explain is this phenomenon in which you have a ruling elite that is up there from the 19th century to the 21st century and how they did it. I try to refrain from value judgment. So depending on whether or not you like them, it could be a good thing or it could be a bad thing. I'm just trying to tell you how it happened, and I'm trying to propose how it happened. So I think I'm pretty safe. Aside from that, I'm very happy to say that just about 2 weeks after my book was released in the U.S., and in the U.S. it's published with the University of Washington Press, there's another book published with the University of Wisconsin Press called Royal Capitalists, which deals with the crown property issue, and you can order that. But anyway, if anyone's going to be put in jail, it's probably going to be that book before mine. So I'm quite... and okay, so before we get on with this, I just would like to say a few things about the images. This image is an image which I took from the Yawarat Historical Center at Wat Traimit. It's the Overseas Chinese Museum in Bangkok. It's in Bangkok Chinatown, and it shows a small miniature model of a street market in front of a Chinese shrine, a market scene, right? So the capitalists, right? And then in the very back there, you actually see a blurred image of King Rama V, right? So that's the crown. And I was trying to convince the press to have this as the cover of the book, because you see the person with the hat there taking the picture in the shadows. That is me. It would be really cool if I was on the cover of my book, right? But the press did not agree. So you get a very elegant image instead. This picture. There's another story that goes with this picture, right? Which is also another important part of what this presentation is going to be about. If I can go back here, right? So this is the first day I got my author's copy. I took the MRT and I went to Silom station and I took a picture of the book with the statue of King Washirawut Rama VI. This is significant because, and this is a part why it had taken me 10 years to get this book published, because as soon as I say there's an alliance between the crown and the capitalists, an alliance between the Thai monarchy and the ethnic Chinese entrepreneur, the reviewer would say, didn't you read The Jews of the Orient? Don't you know that Rama VI hate the Chinese? He singled out the Chinese as the largest minority in which the Thai nationalist narrative would be formed against. So he singled out the Chinese to say what is not Thai in his way of building the Thai nationalist movement. So how could there be an alliance between the crown and the capitalists? To say that is, and of course, who brought up this idea, right? It has been presented by many very prominent academics, intellectuals of former times, the likes of G. William Skinner or even Benedict Anderson, right? So to suggest that the crown, especially the sixth king, would be aligned with the Chinese capitalists is absurd. Yet, that is what I'm going to argue. So I am very proud that I managed to publish a book that says the ethnic Chinese and the founding of the Thai nation and have the statue of King Rama VI on it, right? Because this is another major controversial claim. So, okay, so we have to go back to this idea of when did the nation state happen in Siam or Thailand. And a wider question is that does the nation state, does it necessarily have to be post-colonial? And I think this is very problematic in the case of Thailand in that, well, if you look at our neighbors in Southeast Asia, all the other ASEAN neighbors, they became independent nations after the Second World War, right? They had a colonial period and then they had an Independence Day, right? And then they became a nation, right? So the general idea is that Asia became, nation states emerged in Asia during the post-colonial, right? So then when we have a country that was not completely colonized, then it becomes more complicated to see how the nation state emerged, right? And some, not many, but there are some people who say, well, the modernity, we could say that modernity started in the mid-19th century, especially with the signing of the Bowring Treaty in 1855, which is kind of like the point in which the West came in, right? So that's the beginning of modernity in the reign of King Mongkut, right? And I feel that this is very, myself coming from a Chinese history point of view, you call this the impact response paradigm, right? So it's kind of like suggesting that modernity cannot happen in Asia if the West does not come in, right? And I think the West was very important in pushing things along, but I would disagree that it's completely because of the West, right? So maybe not that, right? And then you have people who say, oh, King Chulalongkorn, right, Rama V, right, who reigned between 1868 to 1910, was the modernizer. And this is what you get in mainstream Thai history textbooks, right? King Chulalongkorn was the modernizer, and there were train tracks, telegraph poles, hospitals, and all that during his reign. And his reign coincided with the Meiji Restoration, right? Meiji regime was 1868, the exact same year, right? And so maybe this was when the modern nation state came about. And I think Thongchai Vinichakul in his book Siam Mapped, which many of you would be familiar with, would suggest that it was when the West came in and we had to decide where the British and French colonies ended and where Siam started. So we had to make modern maps. And so with the making of modern maps, Siam became a modern nation in a way. But there are also questions about this from other people and from myself as well. For example, very prominent academics like the late Benedict Anderson would suggest that the modernization that took place in the late 19th, early 20th century under the absolute monarchy was actually almost like a colonizing process. So like Bangkok was urbanized, Bangkok was modernized only as much as Batavia or Penang or Malacca or Singapore as colonial cities were modernized. So Bangkok was only modernized so that it's on par with other colonial cities in Southeast Asia. So it wasn't really a modern nation state. It was just modernizing to be within the same plane with major cities in the region. There's also suggestion, and with that, we connected to that argument is that, in fact, the Thai monarchy, especially King Chulalongkorn, ruled Siam as a colony, and so that wasn't the birth of the modern nation state. From my point of view, I think there's also an issue with Siam Mapped, with Thongchai's Siam Mapped as well, because I think that, even though there are clear boundaries of the nation, if you go back to Political Science 101, what are the four main components of the modern nation state? It's the territory, right? A limited, a clearly demarcated territory, the territory of the nation, right? Which, of course, Thongchai said we had a modern map made during the fifth reign. There are the people residing, the citizens, right? The people residing within those territories. There's the sovereign power, and there's the government that uses that sovereign power. But the thing is that from 1855 onwards, from 1855 to 1938, there was something called extraterritoriality. There was extraterritorial rights. So there were people who were in Siam at that time, but were not within the control of the Siamese government's judicial power. So in a way, the sovereign power did not expand to every corner of the nation's territory, because there were a large number of people who were colonial subjects and had extraterritorial rights. So in that sense, if we would take the basic definition of the components of the modern nation state into consideration, you can't have that kind of nation state if you still have extraterritorial rights, right? So that's also another argument against it. And some people say the Siamese nation started in the reign of King Wachirawudrama VI because he started the nationalist movement. And so the nation must have started then because he started the nationalist movement. But then his nationalist movement was not your typical nationalist movement, because he equated the nation to the person of the monarch. And so you can be part of the nation by being loyal to the crown. And so this doesn't have much to do with the territorial boundaries. This doesn't have much to do with the people, the citizens. It's basically l'état c'est moi, right? Like the monarch and the nation is the same. It's not your typical idea of what nationalism is from the Western models. And of course, if you go back to the four categories of four components of what the nation state is supposed to be, right, in Political Science 101, you would then say, oh, during the reign of Washira, would you also had people with extraterritorial rights? And so, can this really be the nation? And so, if you read Benedict Anderson's study of the Thai state, the state of Thai studies, came out sometime in the 1980s, ancient work, but very classic. He would say that he thought that the modern nation state actually came about in the Siamese Revolution of 1932, because that was when the nation meant the territory and the people who resided within it. And that was more of a of the territorial nation, what we understand as to be the meaning of the nation state. And then there's the conclusion of the Second World War. Some people would say, I haven't heard many people who said the nation state only came about at the conclusion of the Second World War, but a lot of things also change at the conclusion of the Second World War. I would say, even though the nation had become a territorial nation, a modern nation state, after the revolution of 1932, but after the Second World War, you have a situation where the elite from the 19th century returns to power, and it becomes the nation as we know it, and it is a nation that is recognized by the global community. We got a place in the UN and all that, right? So is that, and that is also the time when all our ASEAN neighbors get to become nation states as well. So if we think that we have the same narrative for our Southeast Asian neighbors, and Thailand were one of them, then perhaps the conclusion of the Second World War could be seen as the beginning of the nation state. But then again, I leave this question in red. Does the nation state really have to be post-colonial? And if we were never colonized, if Thailand was never colonized, right, do we get to be a nation state? Or not, right? This got me thinking. Okay. Now, I think we need to expand our understanding of what a nation state is a bit more. I think just holding to the four components of the nation state, just holding to the definition of the territorial nation, it would make us miss out on a lot of things. And I think if we try to compare with other countries in Asia that was not completely colonized, we might get some ideas. And I think that the nationalist movements in other places that started before the Second World War would show that actually this idea of a modern nation does not have to only be within the confines of the four components of the nation state, right? And that is China and Siam. And in here, I have my two favorite characters in modern history. Sun Yat-sen, who was the leader of the Chinese Revolution, the Xinhai Revolution, and he became the first president. He was only president for 3 months, but anyway, the period in which I would say he was the most politically influential was towards the end of his life, like the last 14 years of his life. So between the Xinhai, the Chinese Revolution in 1911, and his death in 1925. It's very interesting, these characters, right? They overlap a lot, like the Meiji Emperor in Japan and King Chulalongkorn. Their reigns overlap almost completely. And King Washirawut Rama VI, right, the guy was supposedly credited for starting the nationalist movement in Siam. His reign was 1910 to 1925, right? And you have other similarities, other parallels as well, right? The Republic of China was established. Sun Yat-sen was inaugurated as the first president on the 1st of January 1912. Sun Yat-sen first became president of the Republic of China on January 1st, 1912. I find this very cute because King Washirawut Rama VI was born on January 1st, 1912. So it's the same day. And within the same month, there was an attempted coup, right? And what they call the Palace Revolt of 1912, which had very clear, received very obvious influence from the supposed success of the Chinese Revolution, right? It was a Republican movement. It included a plot for regicide, and the people who plotted it were very impressed by Sun Yat-sen's nationalist narratives, right? So you have a lot of similarities between these two countries, and a lot of my book is about the competition between Chinese nationalism, which was driven by Sun Yat-sen and his cohort, and Siamese or Thai nationalism, which was supported, propagated by Washirawut and his followers, which happened around the same time, right? So I would like to suggest that from my point of view, the nation and nationalism in Siam and China happened during this time, but it's not your typical territorial nation that fits in the four categories of the four components that I mentioned earlier. Why? In Sun Yat-sen's case, it's very clear that it's a transnational kind of nationalism. Why? You might have heard, if you do Chinese history at all, there's a very popular slogan that says the overseas Chinese are the mothers of the revolution, right? So Sun Yat-sen spent a period of his life with his brother, who owned a grocery store in Hawaii. And he connected with the overseas Chinese. So for a part of his life, he was an overseas Chinese. And he spent a lot of time traveling through Southeast Asia, in Siam as well, and across the world, meeting with overseas Chinese, the overseas Chinese community, gaining support for his movement from the overseas Chinese. And the idea is that the overseas Chinese community would finance the revolution, would support the revolution. And so the idea is that if your ancestors are Chinese, then you are Chinese. Then you must be a Chinese nationalist. Then you must support the Chinese nation, regardless of where you live in the world, regardless of whether you're a fourth generation Chinese descendant. If you have Chinese blood in you, then you are a Chinese, right? And it's very, so you see this transnational aspect of it very clearly, right? And you also see the basis of the first nationality law, citizenship law of the Republic of China that says it's based on blood. If you have a Chinese ancestor on your father's side, then you're a Chinese, regardless of where you are. Of course, this was changed in the 20th century, but during this time, the first law code of citizenship was by blood. On the other hand, in Siam, Washirawut said, Washirawut presented that the nation and the monarch is the same. And he has this narrative that in the reign of Rama V, King Chulalongkorn was the protector of the nation. And because King Chulalongkorn and his brilliant government negotiated with the colonizers, Siam was not colonized. And therefore, the monarch is the protector of the nation. And therefore, if you love the nation, you have to be devoted and loyal to the monarch, because the monarch protects the nation. So that's the narrative, right? And a lot of people, I think people don't give Washirawut enough credit, right? People say, well, of course he would say that, right? Because the position of the crown was very precarious in the early 20th century, right? You just have the Qing dynasty being overthrown in 1911, right? And then the Romanovs in Russia were also overthrown in the Russian Revolution. So the position, there's like one monarchy after the other being overthrown, right? So he would have to like have a nationalist movement in order to save his own position, right? Safeguard his own position. That is probably true, but I think it's only part of the story. And a very important thing to look at is that two things. First of all, there was a census that was done during the reign of King Washirawut, and it put the Thai population to just below 10 million. And you have Japanese sources and Chinese Republican sources that suggest that between 3 and 3.5 million of the total population in Siam are eligible for Chinese citizenship because they are of Chinese descent. And this is not just documents from the Kuomintang party archives or the documents from the Japanese government. They were doing surveys because they wanted to know how much money would be sent to China if they attacked China, right? So they did this survey. It's also, this 3 to 3.5 million is a figure that was published in the Washington Post and in major papers in the West as well. So it's a widely known number that around 1/3 of the Siamese population are eligible for Chinese citizenship. On top of that, right, the richest among this 1/3 of the Chinese. First of all, this 1/3 are the people who are in the service sector, merchants, entrepreneurs, right? The people who dominate the Thai economy. But the richest among them are registered as colonial subjects, and so what I'm saying is that if Washirawut was going to have a nationalist movement that is based on your typical territorial nation that demands loyalty to only one nation, right? He would have to chase away perhaps 1/3 of the population, and most definitely the richest and the most influential in the Thai economy. The richest people would have to be excluded from the Thai economy. And he did not, I don't think he would want to do that. So I think the genius of this royalist nationalism that equates the monarch to the nation is that you can be a Tajiu speaking Chinese descent who is a French subject, and you can still be part of the Thai national project if you give money to the Wild Tiger Corps, or if you buy the King an aircraft, or if you donate money for buying the battleship in which Washirawut acquired during his reign. Now, I'm not making this up on my own. I have documents to prove it. Why? Because, in fact, I would say from Rama the First to Rama the Eighth, we're not going to deal with Rama the Ninth because his reign was very long, and he reigned during the Cold War period, which is a different story. But from Rama the First to Rama the Eighth, Washirawut Rama the Sixth was the king who got the highest amount of donations, and he had the most projects completed with donated money, and the biggest donors were the Chinese. And why do I know this? He wrote an article called, I translate into English, "Thank You to My Chinese Friends." And this was published in the Journal of the Royal Thai Navy because the king wanted to purchase a battleship, and he was not supported by fundings from the Navy or from the government, and so he decided to do it with donations. And the largest chunk of the donation money came from the Chinese merchants. And so he published this article in the Navy's journal, the Journal of the Royal Thai Navy, and it's called "Thank You to My Chinese Friends." Does anyone ever quote that No, everyone quotes Jews of the Orient, right? And so he wrote a lot of very nasty things on the Chinese, but he also wrote things like, thank you to my Chinese friends as well. Thailand also had one of the earliest air forces. We had planes, aircrafts in Thailand during the reign of Rama VI. Shortly after, very soon after the Wright brothers were first in flight in North Carolina, right? The king wanted to start an air force. So Chinese merchants were buying aircrafts to populate that air force, right? From a very early time on, right? So then, of course, people would immediately say, but he wrote Jews of the Orient, and Jews of the Orient is an awful piece. It's racist, it's anti-Chinese. It's all of that. It's not only anti-Chinese, I would say, it's also anti-Semitic, because it was based on he compared the Chinese problem to the Jewish problem in Europe, right? So I'm sure there's a translation of it already, but very surprisingly, this is something that has been republished in Thailand so many times, and you can find it in any university library. I'm not sure why they're so excited about it, but basically he says that the Chinese come to Thailand, make a lot of money, send all their money back home, and while they're in Thailand, they only use Chinese goods, and they don't contribute to the Thai economy, and they are even servants of many masters. So they have a connection with the Chinese state, and they also try to get themselves registered as colonial subjects. So how can you trust them? They are not loyal subjects of the king. So what is this? Why did he have to write that? I would say he wrote that as a marketing ploy. Because as soon as he wrote that, you have leaders of the Chinese community like Siam Hutseng who owned the first and only bilingual newspaper, Thai-Chinese newspaper, coming out to write and say that it's not true. Most of us are very loyal. There are only a few very bad people, but most of us are very loyal, and the king is awesome, and we do not want to stage a revolution and all that. And then you have all these Chinese merchants, entrepreneurs, giving so much money, donating money to buy the battleship, buying guns for the Wild Tiger Corps, buying aircrafts and everything, to prove their loyalty and to keep their good connection with the crown, and to get themselves mentioned in the king's article, thank you, my Chinese friends, right? And there are also very many ethnic Chinese entrepreneurs working in Rama VI court who were colonial subjects as well. So the king was not anti-Chinese per se, right? I mean, he worked with them, but there's a very practical reason for him to establish royalist nationalism in such a way. Okay, I am already running late. I will finish soon. That's okay. Okay, well. Okay, so no one's falling asleep yet. So major arguments of this book, right? First is that maybe we need to expand a bit. If we look at the nationalism, is not just territorial nationalism. There's something behind this idea of royalist nationalism as well, especially if you are going to allow the idea that we might have a nationalist movement during the colonial period. While there's still colonial influence in the country, we can still have a nationalist movement, which I think I would like to allow. And very closely connected to that is this thing about extraterritoriality. Extraterritoriality was supposed to be in the title of my book. When I proposed it to the publishers, I said, the Crown and the Capitalists, the ethnic Chinese, extraterritoriality, and the founding of the Thai nation. And the publisher said, it's not Googleable. It's so long. It's a mouthful. Like, people can't even pronounce it. Extraterritoriality is a tongue twister, right? So they dropped it. But this is a very important part of what I'm trying to present in my book, right? Is that extraterritoriality was not a problem for the Siamese elite before 1932. this is because if you grew up in Thailand and have been indoctrinated by the mainstream history textbooks, every time they talk about extraterritoriality, every time they talk about the Bowring Treaty, which started it all, in Thai they use the word เสียสิทธิสภาพนอกอาณาเขต เสีย is to lose. สิทธิสภาพนอกอาณาเขต is extraterritoriality. So it's like we lost something, and it's expressed as a loss of we lost part of our sovereignty, independence, and all that. So it's a loss. It's seen as a shame and all that, right? But I was kind of confused because I study China and Japan, East Asia, and I noticed that Japan managed to abolish extraterritoriality before the end of the 19th century. They were forced into it after Commodore Matthew Perry came, and so in the 1850s. Before the end of the 19th century, they managed to negotiate the abolition of extraterritoriality in Japan. And in fact, in Siam, right, there have been suggestions that when Washirawut decided to have Siam become a part of take part in the First World War, it was so that he can renegotiate unfair treaties, right? But in fact, that part of and extraterritoriality was reduced eventually. But we have documents that prove, especially from Prince Damrong, for example, a very high-ranking official in the court of King Chulalongkorn, who said that extraterritoriality is not the first priority of the Thai government. We don't need to abolish it so quickly. And it was only completely abolished in 1938 under the People's Party, under People's Songkram's government. So why is this? Now, if you think of Siam and I really like, this is like the nationalist map, right? This is from one of the major geography textbooks, which from my dad's time as a student, and I grew up looking at this map, and it's like all the parts of Thailand that was taken by the foreigners, right? So, we were really big, right? We included Laos and Cambodia and parts of Burma and Malaysia and all that as well, right? Which, of course, if you read Thongchai Vinichakul's Siam map, you know that this is an overclaim. This is a nationalist narrative. But if you try to visualize Siam in the mid-19th century, okay, in the map of Southeast Asia, we were the only loner. We were the only country that was not a part of an empire. So we were not competing economically with Laos, Cambodia, Burma, Malaysia. We were competing with the British Empire, with the French Empire, with the Dutch Empire. We were competing with empires. And there's absolutely no way that we can compete with empires as an independent nation. We're not as big as China, right? So the thing is that extraterritoriality is actually the lifeline of the Thai ruling class. Why do I say that? I say that because if you're a colonial subject, if you're a British colonial subject and you live in Malaya, then you're under the control of the British colonial masters, right? But if you move from Malaya to Siam, you're a British colonial subject in Siam, the British can't quite control you because Siam is marginally independent, and the Siamese government can't really control you either. I have an example, very clear, many examples of this. For example, a guy runs into trouble in some northern province like Kamphaeng Phet or something, and he looks Chinese, he speaks Chinese, but he tells the police that he is a British subject. So the police then sends his information to the consulate in Bangkok. The British consulate in Bangkok looks at the information and says he's not registered in Bangkok, but he might be registered in Rangoon, he might be registered in Singapore, he might be registered in Penang, he might be registered somewhere else. We need to check with them first, right? And this is before internet, right? So, if they would even want to check it up, it would take, 6 months, 2 years, something, by the time in which the guy is long gone, right? So most of the time they don't even check. But then they don't want to take the risk, right? Because if he actually turns out to be a colonial subject, then you can get into big trouble, right? The second Opium War in China was all about this, right? Not respecting extraterritorial rights, right? So if you're an ethnic Chinese who is a colonial subject, it's really Siam is really good to do business in, and you have a large community there. You have basically the ethnic Chinese control the economy, and on top of that, the monarchy systematically doles out favors, allow them to work in the court. You can be a colonial subject, and you can be a nobility in the court as well. You can be tax farmers, you can make a lot of money, you can get contracts from the government and all that. So in other words, I'm saying that the Siamese government had neither money to bribe them nor force to make them become Siamese citizens, but the situation in which they get Siam is a gray area in which they can basically do whatever they can not be under the control of the colonial masters and not be under full control of the Siamese government, makes it very good for business. And that is why, at least up to the Second World War, you have the largest overseas Chinese community in Siam in comparison with the rest of Southeast Asia. And I would like to propose that because ethnic Chinese merchants control the trade network across the South China Sea, I would like to propose that while you have the British Empire in Burma and Malaya, you have the Dutch in the Dutch East Indies, you have the French in the French Indochina, Siam was the ethnic Chinese merchant network headquarters. And that was what supported the Thai economy to be competitive with the economy of the empires that surrounded it. And so there was no need to hurry to negotiate it away, right? So, and another thing that is important is that we talk a bit about the revolutionaries, about the people's parties who brought about the transformation of Siam in 1932, right? Okay, maybe we can go to the last slide here. Yes. So, I propose in my book that we have three kinds of nations and nationalism since the day of Washirawut. We have the first kind is the royalist, I call it the royalist colonialist nation. And this is the nation is the monarch equates the nation, and if you're loyal to the king, then you're a part of the Chinese nation, of the Siamese nation, and the ruling class was supported by this network of rich Chinese entrepreneurs who were doing business based from Siam, and that is why the royalist government was not in a hurry to abolish extraterritorial rights. And then you have the nation state of the People's Party, which came into being between 1932, the revolution, and the end of the Second World War. And this is, so when they staged the revolution and supposedly transformed the nation into a constitutional monarchy, the meaning of what the nation was for the People's Party and for Washirawut are very different. So Washirawut said that Siam, the monarch protects the nation, so if you love the nation, you have to love the monarch, right? But from the point of view of the People's Party, they say the nation are the people who live in the nation, the people, and the territories. And the narrative even goes as far as to say that the absolute monarchs were so busy trying to save their position that they negotiated away half the kingdom in this picture, right? So we lost a large part of our nation during the reign of King Chulalongkorn because he was compromising with the imperialists, right? So this is the People's Party's narrative, this loss of land, right? And so the People's Party say that the nation is a territory of the nation and the people, the citizens who live within the territory. And so their first priority was to abolish extraterritoriality completely so that people would have to choose whether to be Thai or to be Chinese or to be a colonial subject which no longer had perks being in Siam. And part of that was also to try to weaken this crown capitalist alliance because a large part, right, the money purse was the ethnic Chinese entrepreneurs who supported the crown. And we see this very clearly in the People's Party's government because if you remember, on the eve of the Second World War, there was the Indochina conflict, right, where People's Songkram's government invaded parts of French Indochina, and there was a war, and then Japan came in to mediate, and Siam got chunks of territories in Laos and parts of Cambodia, and that was why we still have the Victory Monument. The Victory Monument is from that victory, which was very short-lived. And then after the war, we had to return all the territories to French Indochina because we wanted to join the United Nations. But this is very important because during that period, as soon as the territories were acquired, as soon as those provinces in Cambodia and Laos became part of the Thai nation, everyone who lived, who was born in those territories, got the full rights of the Thai citizens, became Thai citizens immediately. And this is why you have many top leaders of the Khmer Rouge being educated at Thammasat University. Nuon Jia, the brother number 2, spent some time working in the Thai Ministry of Commerce, right? That's because he was a citizen for a while during the Second World War. So what I'm trying to show is that the meaning of the nation for the People's Party is clearly a territorial nation. It's not a royalist nation. Now, after the war, and this is important, this is why you need to understand the difference between the idea of the nation state during the royalist period and during the People's Party period, is because after the Second World War, right, basically, the Japanese were defeated, right? Oh, and this is also another very important thing. Mainstream Thai historiography would say Thailand was victorious in the Second World War because of the Free Thai movement, right? Because actually Thai people wanted to side with the Allied powers, but the government wanted to side with Japan, right? And there's also, to go further than that, they say we were forced into it because Japan arrived and there was no way that we can fight them, so we had to allow them to come through. So we really didn't want to join them. But in fact, if you look at the narrative of what the nation meant for the People's Party, for People's Songkram, it is impossible to imagine that People's Songkram, the government under People's Songkram's premiership, would join the Allied powers because the royalist nation was not anti-imperialist, okay? Washirawut's government, Chulalongkorn's government was not anti-imperialist. They could work with the French and the British, especially the British. The People's Party, the revolutionary government, was anti-imperialist, and this is why we had the Indochina conflict, right? We had that war, and this idea that the two patriots, the true nationalists, were the People's Party. We're going to reclaim the territories lost by the absolute monarchy, and so they had very clear anti-imperialist expressions. So of all the superpowers, right? It's impossible to imagine that the People's Party would join the Allied powers, because that would mean joining with the French and the British, which they have portrayed as allies of the unpatriotic royalist nation, right? So, in fact, to go along with their narrative of what the nation meant, of course, if they were going to take sides, they would have to take sides of Japan, because Japan was the only superpower not to have colonized supposedly parts of the Siamese kingdom before, right? So anyway, so Japan was defeated in the war, and so after the war, you have the return of royalist political power, and this continued more or less up to the present day, with, of course, complicated issues in between. But the interesting thing about this part is that the royalist power returned after the Second World War, but the nation had already become a territorial nation. And the world of the Cold War period was already used to the idea of territorial nation, so there's no turning back, right? The People's Party's government, People's Songkram's government had already go around establishing local community schools and organizations and such all across the country. And that's why what we see through much of the Cold War period is the royalist nation trying to expand to cover the territorial nation. And I would say this is also part of why we see the King Rama IX, for so much of his reign, having to go his image in the evening news, visiting every secret corner of the kingdom, right? So that is extending the presence of the state into those areas. So after the war, especially during the Cold War period, we have a territorial nation in which is defined by the national boundaries and by the people, but also very heavily politically influenced and defined by the person of the monarch and the institution of the monarchy and the military that goes with it, right? And I say, and the winners so far are still the crown and the capitalists. Of course, I don't want to give away everything that is in this book, even though it's already 1 hour. But I would like to say that one very interesting thing, the last point that I would like to make is that it is very impressive how versatile and how adaptable these two groups are, the crown and the Chinese capitalists. We see them moving from one superpower to the next, and they always come up on top, right? In the 18th century, before the Western imperialist power came in, they were very Chinese-oriented, right? Up to the reign of King Rama III, right? Then when we get to Rama IV, King Mongkut, there's the Bowring Treaty, the Opium War happened in China and all that. Within the three reigns, Rama IV, V, and VI, completely reoriented towards Britain. Britain became the center of world power. Second World War, oops. But that was not the crown, right? That was the People's Party that allied themselves with the Japanese. After the Second World War, very clearly switching to the Americans, right? So the Americans supported them. And at the very end of my book, I think we're seeing the latest switching of alliance of both the crown, the conservative political power, and also the economic elite, ethnic Chinese economic elite, switching towards the People's Republic of China in the 21st century. So, yes, the end. Questions, comments, expression of love, anger, and confusion are welcome. Thank you.
Wow. Well, thank you very much. I can say that Ajahn has held back enough that there is more in the book than what she told you, but that was pretty exhaustive, and thank you. You've set up the scene quite well. We've got time for questions. I'd just like to take the moderator's prerogative and maybe ask one question, which I think a lot of people would be interested in. You've set the scene very well to talk about the very strong early support of the ethnic Chinese for the monarchy, and I think the big question is about now and modern day, and you conclude by saying that, you know, you're seeing a shift overall of the Thai nation, the government. It's not so clear where the monarchy is on that, but we can assume quite clearly where their sentiment is. And along with them, the ethnic Chinese and really the money. You know, this place is dominated by some very big ethnic Chinese-controlled groups. So how important do you think the ongoing support of the ethnic Chinese is for the monarchy in that kind of arrangement you were talking about in the book?
Okay. Another very big issue that I did not touch upon enough in my presentation is that I did say that I'm only focusing on the elite, the rich Chinese, the top of the pyramid, right, the entrepreneurs. And in the way that the crown, right, deals with the Chinese, I see a trend very clearly from Washirawut's reign onwards to, I would say, almost to the present day, or at least to the end of the Cold War, is that you have good Chinese and bad Chinese. And if you go to the museum in Chinatown, you would see all of the good Chinese, right? The good Chinese are hardworking, or loyal to the crown, or industrious, docile citizens who are grateful for Thailand for taking them and all that. So those are the good Chinese. So the good Chinese become tax farmers, become members of the court, becomes nobility, gets contracts, government contracts and all that. And even later on, you see good Chinese being taking a large part in the government, even in the post Second World War period, right? And who are the bad Chinese? The bad Chinese are set out very clearly as well from the time of Washirawut. The bad Chinese during the time of King Chulalongkorn and King Washirawut were the secret societies. In Thai, the Ang Yi. There's a law, right? The Ang Yi law, right? These are the mafia gangs, the people who go around racketeering and run gambling dens and prostitution and drug runners and all that. These are bad Chinese, right? And they are to be violently put down because they're bad Chinese, right? And if you look at the narrative of King Washirawut about the good Chinese and the bad Chinese, you see very clearly that it's like, if you're the good Chinese, we will support you. If you're the bad Chinese, we will kill you. And so it's very convincing that you should try and be the good Chinese, right? And so you see from then on, you see very clearly the Chinese entrepreneurs, the business people, everything, trying to distance themselves from the secret society, from the Ang Yi. And in fact, one very interesting thing is that King Washirawut, when he writes about the Chinese nationalist movement, especially of Sun Yat-sen, he equates them to the Ang Yi. These are secret societies. So Chinese nationalists, communists, Bolsheviks, Republicans, anything anti-monarchy with Chinese descent, these are the Ang Yi. These are the secret societies. These are the bad people. And you see the trend continue. Who are the bad Chinese of the Cold War? The bad Chinese of the Cold War are the communists, right? You even have the left wing, the anti-monarchists. So it's like there's a trend to divide the good Chinese who are rich and industrious and support the crown, and the bad Chinese who are seditious, right? And after a while, in fact, you start seeing it from Washirawut's reign already, the good Chinese, the rich Chinese trying to distance themselves from the rebellious Chinese. And during the Cold War, you see it very clearly. One very clear example is there was a riot in Chinatown in 1974, and it started with the police brutalizing a cab driver, and then it became a riot that lasted for 2 weeks with dozens of people killed. And the government portrayed it as a secret society, criminal gang activity. And I was reading all the newspapers, Thai language, English, and Chinese that came out during the period of the riots. And you see very clearly that you have the president of the Chamber of Commerce, the president of these Chinese lineage associations, the Association of Chinese Business People and all that, coming out to say, good Chinese do not join the riot, right? We don't join the riot. So what we see in this alliance is that through time, by the time you get to the 21st century, it's aligned by class, right? So the rich Chinese, the elite Chinese, the Chinese entrepreneur would side with the government, even though they're brutalizing the poor Chinese, right? Because you don't want to be grouped with the bad Chinese. If you're a bad Chinese, then you get violently put down, right? So I'm really trying to answer Gwen's question. I'm not going on a segue, but
yeah. Now, back in Thailand, yes, 21st century.
21st century is that, so in the 21st century, you see ethnic Chinese at every level of the social spectrum, the social hierarchy. You see them at every level, but it's very and you also see a new division between a new division within the elite Chinese, and this is really a 21st century thing. I'll spend another 2 minutes on this. The interesting thing.
Other people want to ask questions.
Yes. The interesting thing is that so there used to be this long-standing theory by G. William Skinner that says there is no such thing as a fourth-generation Chinese, because Skinner says that by the fourth generation, all the Chinese in Thailand would have assimilated. I disagree with that because I'm the fourth generation. I still go to in the ceremony of sweeping my grandparents' grave and all that, so we're still very Chinese. What I think actually happens is that by the time you get to the fourth generation, if you haven't established an alliance with the political elite yet, you would not be someone who would show up in books about the overseas Chinese. If you read Skinner's Chinese Society in Thailand, if you read Pimpapai and Jeffrey Sung's The History of the Thai Chinese, you see very clearly that it reads more like the Chinese in Bangkok and people who have connections with the Bangkok elite, right? Things change in the 1990s with the democratization of this country, but also with China opening up and Chinese money coming into Southeast Asia and Chinese tourists and Chinese investment in Southeast Asia and Thailand. And what happens is that for the first time in the 21st century, you start to see the Chinese entrepreneurs in the countryside being able to make it big with Chinese investment money, with Chinese tourist money and all that, and doing business across the Mekong River and all that. And so for the first time in the 21st century, you have Chinese entrepreneurs who don't need to have connections with the political elite in Bangkok, right? And so this is where, I would like to say, this is also key in the red-yellow divide, is that basically in the yellow side, they have the patriotic Chinese, right? But these are the kind of old money, the old group of entrepreneurs that have close relations with the right-wing conservative royalist politics. As for the newer, it's not to say that the Reds don't have Chinese. The Reds have a lot of Chinese, but they are the new group that were allowed to make it big with the opening up of China and the West and of China, and at the same time, the brief period of democratization in Thailand as well. So with these, basically the conflict that is happening now, and you get into the political divide that is happening right now. A part of it is also the division between the old Chinese money that came from the group that is aligned with the royalist power, and the new Chinese money that is more aligned with the democratized government later. So you see this very interesting phenomenon. But more interestingly, I look into these two Chinese groups, if I dare say the Red Chinese and the Yellow Chinese. They are both trying to connect with the People's Republic of China. So right now we have a situation where the Crown and the capitalists and the Yellow Chinese want to get on the PRC bandwagon. At the same time, you have the Reds also want to get into the PRC bandwagon. So in a way, I think it is very clearly that they're competing for favors from China, and at the same time, I think it's not very clear who's China going to take side with. I think China's diversifying its risks, right? So, yes.
Very interesting. I'd love to come back to that, but I'm not sure we have time. I can see Peter Jansen up there, a long-time member, who's written a lot about Chinese in Thailand, dying to ask a question. Peter.
Thanks for your presentation. It was really interesting. I wonder if you can go, I'll do a historical question, not a 21st century question. I wonder if you can go back to the origin of this alliance between the Crown and the capitalists. You've talked a lot about from Chula onwards, but I mean the first four Chakri kings. I mean, where did this alliance begin? Because if you look at the early history of Bangkok, you've got a huge dearth of labor, right? And so the kings invite the Chinese to come over and just do manual labor, if nothing else. So where did the origin of the Chinese elite? I mean, you have a few families like the Wang Lis who came here with money, but I mean the origin of the Chinese sort of elite capitalists who grow up here, were they already wealthy when they came here, or did the monarchs cultivate these families? And the second part of my question is was there a deliberate attempt to use the Chinese community to counterbalance the colonial powers, or they weren't really colonial powers, but I mean the business powers of the Europeans? I mean, did you find any evidence that the early monarchs deliberately used this business community to counter the Western influence in this country in those early years? Yeah.
Thank you very much. I don't think it was consciously cultivated by anyone, but I think the situation is that in the 18th century, in the 18th century, the center of world commerce, the center of money was China. That was the most lucrative trade, and during the first three reigns, the tribute trade was very important in building the Thai monarchies, the Siamese kings, their wealth, right? How important was this? I have an example. So King Taksin, right, after Ayutthaya was conquered and burned and sacked and looted and all that, and King Taksin said, okay, I cannot rebuild Ayutthaya, so he established a new capital in Thonburi. And the idea was that he would bring his Chinese connections to come and help rebuild the war-torn kingdom, right? But the problem was King Taksin his reign was 15 years long, and he spent almost the entire time of his reign trying to be accepted by the Qing dynasty, being allowed into the official tribute trade system, because you cannot send tribute to the Chinese emperor if the Chinese emperor is not convinced that you're the rightful king. Right? If you're a bandit or something, you cannot send tribute. And if you cannot send tribute to the Chinese emperor, then you cannot legally be a part of the tribute trade. You can do piracy and all that. And that's not to say that there's no trade during King Taksin's time, but it was illegal from the point of view of the Chinese empire. And so he tried very hard, and finally, in the very last years of his reign, the Chinese emperor accepted him. In fact, the documents that with the royal seal, with the imperial seal that says that he is accepted as the rightful king of Siam, arrived after he was executed. So the interesting thing is that what would Rama I do, right? Rama I is like, look, Taksin took almost 15 years to be accepted, right? We do not have time to spend another 15 years. So he presented himself as Taksin's son-in-law, who had taken Thaksin's clan name. And that is why the clan name of the current dynasty is the Zheng, or the Thae clan name, is the same clan name as King Thaksin, in order to show that there's a continuation. And in that sense, the Chinese emperor allowed tribute trade to continue into the reign of King Rama I. And this continued. And another very clear example is King Rama III, who was not the son of the queen, but he was able to ascend the throne, and Prince Mongkut, who was the son of the queen, had to go and be a monk for the entire third reign and then become Rama IV, right? The reason why King Rama III got to ascend the throne was because he was in control of the tribute trade, of the China trade. So you can see that the China trade was very important at that time. And who was carrying out the China trade? It was they acquired the help of the ethnic Chinese as their trade agents. And by the time of Rama III, you already started having colonial powers in many parts of Southeast Asia. And the Dutch had tax farmers, and they also had employed the ethnic Chinese as the tax farmers. So Rama III did the same thing. And then the interesting thing is that when you get to Rama IV, and there's the Bowring Treaty, right? Then the king knew before that there was the Opium War. So it's very clear that the world order is changing. The world order around Siam in the mid-19th century has changed from being China-centered to being revolving around the British Empire. So the Bowring Treaty was essentially bringing Siam into the new world order. If you want to be part of this British imperial world order, you have to have a flat import-export rate. You have to allow for extraterritorial rights and all that, right? The requirements of many of them are very similar between these unfair treaties, the Treaty of Nanjing and Treaty of Bowring, they just copy each other, right? The interesting thing is that both the crown and the capitalists, the Chinese entrepreneurs, both managed to adapt to the situation, to then move to hang on to the British Empire, right? The crown facilitated the empire through the Bowring Treaty, and the Chinese capitalists then tried to get registered as colonial subjects or claim extraterritorial rights. And so in this sense, they managed to adapt and adjust to the world around them and came up on top. I know one very last thing, very interesting. I had a colleague, a professor from Australia who worked on forestry, history of forestry, and he came and present his book, and he said, British documents said that in the late 19th century, all the timber industry, wood mills and such, in the north of Thailand was under the control of the British. We own the forest industry in Siam and in Burma. At the same time, I look at Chinese documents. The Chinese government says, this is in the early 20th century, the Kuomintang government says, we own the timber industry in Siam, along with other things, along with the rice industry, the tin, the rubber, the everything. So is someone lying? No one's lying, because the timber industry, the wood mills, the people who trade timber and all that in northern Siam are mostly British subjects, but they are Chinese who are British subjects. So according to the British documents, they own the industry. According to the Chinese documents, these guys were sending money back home, right? So they were Chinese. So this is another thing. You can't look at the late 19th, early 20th century with our understanding of what citizenship is in the 21st century, right? At that time, you can be considered as a Chinese citizen by the Chinese government, considered as a colonial subject by the British, and considered as a Siamese part part of the Siamese nation by the Siamese court. So, yes.
Right. Well, thank you for that. And one question there. Please identify yourself.
Sorry, just not affiliated, but this is something that I find very fascinating because...
could you identify yourself with?
My name is Sar. I'm just a citizen, but I'm half Chinese. My dad's Chinese from Bangkok, and I'm from North Siam, or Lana. And whatever, all that stuff you said, stuff that I've researched as well, and it's very fascinating because I agree with a lot of the analysis. But last thing you said, I was very curious about in terms of history, because I feel like this would, and I always want to ask about your book, how much do you include of, let's say, counterfactual narratives in terms of the forestry over there, or how the local elites played a role into this in the context? I love how you contextualize it, but then at the same time, I feel there was also other powers at play over there, because the nationalization of Thailand involves also the wiping out of ethnic groups, other ethnic groups, especially in South Thailand, where they are, let's say, Patani, north of Thailand, where they are Lana, and other places like Laos and other ethnic groups, even belonging let's say, Thai ethnic group invasion of Thailand, such as the Mon. And it's funny because I noticed in your map as well that you said that there is the mention of Shan states over there. Shan is still over there, which would be essentially the Lana kingdoms. I feel like there's a lot of interesting history coming out right now that is from especially Rangoon and also from north of Thailand, where it would provide interesting counterfactual narratives to these things. And I wonder in your book how much you include that or look at that. But I have to say I'm very impressed with your scholarship.
Thank you very much. Very quick answer to that. A very good question. And this is why I think differentiating the royalist nation and the territorial nation is very important, because the royalist nation of Rama VI is made up of the monarch in the middle, and then networks of elite and of entrepreneurs, of connections. And it has very little to do with people who are on the ground in further away areas, especially in the north and the northeast, for example. A very interesting example was when I think the British consulate or some envoy came and asked King Rama V where the border between Siam and Burma was, and his first answer was, you have to ask people who live around there where the border is. I don't know where the border is. So, in fact, the ruling power in Bangkok up to the early 20th century had very little knowledge of what was actually going on. King Rama VI went to Chiang Mai once, went to Sukhothai, went to Nakhon Pathom, went down south, never set foot in the northeast. And so very little was, they knew very little, they cared very little, because they felt they only needed to deal with the colonial powers around there, right? So this is the difference between the territorial nation of the People's Party that kind of actually started to do local community networking and actually building schools in the frontiers and in faraway provinces. And this is why what I said, that after the Second World War, when the royalist nation came back, it had to expand itself and start to try to have an understanding of these further away parts of the nation, both in the north, in the northeast, and most of all in the deep south as well. So you're very much correct in your question. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. I think okay. One last question then. Please. Okay. Sorry. I was looking at that gentleman there and then you. But please keep them short and we'll have a...
Okay, my name is Joel Diamond. I'm just an interested party. This question is maybe kind of coming from not a direct question, but I think I'll ask it in a general way, so I'm sure you can tie it in. And that's talking about language. So language is clearly an important part of national identity, nationalism. So on the one hand, you have Thai language. On the other hand, you have, maybe three hands. You have Mandarin, and then you have local dialects of Chinese as well. So when I say I'll leave it open-ended, can you talk about language in any way that affected the relationship of Chinese, how they related to Thai nationality, how the Thais felt about Chinese and Chinese language? Anything you want to say about language and your topic?
Thank you. Maybe I'll take the two questions and then I'll answer them at one time. Yes.
Okay, good.
Hi, my name's Simon Hollins. I'm a member here. Very much related to what the previous questioner asked. He was referring to language as one of the foundations of national identity that maybe you didn't talk about a lot in those various points that come together to form the national polity. But I just wanted to add to that cultural identity. You didn't discuss much of that aspect of in the nation, in the building of the nation state.
Thank you very much. And I have very good answers for both of them. So language. So if you can get back to my slide. Yes, this one. It's very important that when I say that Thai nationalism and Chinese nationalism were competing at the very beginning, because before Sun Yat-sen, before the first decade of the 20th century, there were already Chinese schools and Chinese newspapers in Siam. There are Chinese schools since a long time ago. But they were all teaching in their own dialects. But the emergence of the Chinese nation state and the Chinese nationalist movement meant that Chinese nationalist leaders would come and try to get support from the overseas Chinese and would tell them that you should have your Chinese education in the national language, what we call Mandarin, in the national language. So from the first decade of the 20th century, you start to have Chinese schools that use Mandarin as the medium of teaching. Okay, maybe it used to be a Taijiu school, maybe it used to be a Hokkien school, a Hainan school, but you have to, if you're a Chinese nationalist, you have to use the Chinese language. And I also talk about it in here because one of the first chapter is on education. It's very clear that the Chinese nationalists viewed the Chinese nation as being a Mandarin nation of that language. So this is another thing that so the Chinese that continued to use dialect, or the Chinese that did not push the use of national language, would be seen as less of a threat, for example. So the establishment of Chinese education in Mandarin was a very clear major part of the Chinese nationalist movement overseas, especially in Siam in my case. Cultural identity. I had a really good answer for this. Oh yes, cultural identity. I talked a bit about the good Chinese and the bad Chinese, right? And I said that during the Cold War, the bad Chinese were commies, right? And it was very dangerous for you to have any connections with your Chinese ancestors because the mainland China had become the People's Republic of China already. So the balance of that, to be Chinese, to express your connection to China, to express your cultural ties to the land of your ancestors, you have to counterbalance that by expressing your overt loyalty and devotion towards the crown. So as much Chinese you want to be culturally, you have to be just as much or not even more royalist. So if you go, like I said, you go to the museum in Chinatown at Wat Rai Mit, there's 6 installations, 6 rooms. 4 out of the 6 rooms are about the relationship between Chinatown and the ethnic Chinese with the royal family. So in order to safely be Chinese, to express your Chineseness, you have to be overtly royalist. During the Cold War, at least, yes. With that, please buy my book. Thank you.
I think you got that point across. Is that so that's all the questions, right?
Yes.
Yes. So I think on that happy note, that's been a brilliant talk, exhaustive and informative. And I think we can all agree we've learnt a lot tonight. So I'd like to give a big hand to you, Ajahn Wasana. Don't forget, if you want the book and you want to reserve it at a special price tonight, the list is on at the reception. You pay 700 baht and it will be here on Friday, but we can keep it as long as you want. You'll have to pick it up though. Otherwise it will be, I think, in bookstores possibly by the end of next week, within the next 10 days. And I think that's about it. Don't forget about tomorrow night if you're interested in the evolution of Bangkok over the last few decades, which will also include a bit about Chinatown. So anyway, thank you all, and thanks Kun Tam for handling that excellent PowerPoint presentation. So good night, everybody. Thank you.